The Dark Star, 180 years before the Dark Portal. As Shattrath's city flourished, Velen urged the Draenor to avoid settling too far outside the stronghold. He did not want to disturb the orc and ogre civilizations in the region. Within a few years, he changed his mind. As the Rangari explored Draenor, they discovered more and more signs that the crash of the Genedar had caused serious harm to the world. The impact had unleashed a mix of arcane, light and void energies that were warping the local flora and fauna. Primals and breakers were emerging from their enclaves, fighting openly with whatever creature they could find. The plant life on Draenor was far more aggressive than on any world Velen and his people had ever visited, and it seemed dangerous to ignore it. Velen decided that it was the Draenor's responsibility to fix what they had broken. Groups of artificers, Rangari, and Vindicators established outposts and cities across Draenor, linking them to the world's arcane ley lines. The greatest of these new settlements was the Temple of Karabor. Tucked away at the eastern edge of Shadowmoon Valley, it would soon become one of the Draenor's holiest and most beautiful sites. Over time, by using arcane and light energies, the Draenor were able to repair the damage done to Draenor. The primals and the breakers quieted within a few decades, and the harm seemed to have been contained. This expansion brought the Draenor into contact with other races. Velen made it clear to the exarchs that he expected his people to avoid conflict with native creatures, but his hopes of keeping the orcs and ogres free of any ill effects from the Draenor's arrival were quickly dashed. The Shadowmoon orcs had always been sensitive to signs of divine power, and they saw meaning in the movements of celestial bodies. When K'ara's remains appeared in the sky, the clan's mystics called the manifestation the Dark Star and worshipped it as a deity. A few bold shaman tried to access K'ara's shadowy power. Touching the fallen Naru's void energy shattered their minds. The Shadowmoon soon decided that the Dark Star's power was not meant to be wielded by mortals. Anyone who tried was sharply rebuked, and if they continued, they would be immediately exiled far from Shadowmoon Valley. Oshugun, Mountain of Spirits. The decaying Naru trapped within the Genedar's crystal wreckage also had an effect on orc society. Just as the Or's remains had begun attracting the souls of fallen Draenor, K'ur began attracting the souls of dead orcs. Once the clans discovered this, shaman made frequent pilgrimage to the Crystal Mountain, which they named Oshugun, to speak with their ancestors. Some of the orc spirits, suffused with light energies that lingered in the Genedar, now had wisdom far beyond what they had known in life. Advice from these ancestors often proved prescient, and clans that obeyed the spirits' words were usually overjoyed at their results. This turn of events deeply troubled the Draenor. Though the Or's remains were emitting void energies, all that was left of the Naru was a small part of its original form. Yet, K'ur was fully intact, and the dark powers bleeding from it seemed incredibly potent. The Draenor did not know what the long-term effects of this would mean for the world or the orcs, and the Shatari Order's quiet missions to study the Genedar yielded no answers. Every action they would think to take would potentially cause disaster. If the orcs were cut off from their ancestors, they might go to war. If K'ur were to suddenly fall deeper into the void, there was no telling what horror might result. In the end, the Draenor did nothing. As they feared, K'ur's void energies would later have detrimental effects on the orcs. When the Draenor had crash-landed on the world, a small society of orcs who dwelled on the Nagrand had taken notice. This society was composed of exiles who had been banished from their clans because they had tapped into the void and lost themselves to madness during their shamanic rites of passage. For generations, these outcasts had gathered in caves below Nagrand, their faces tattooed with the white skull that marked them as pariahs. The exiles expanded their tunnels under Oshugun to investigate the strange newcomers, In time, they tapped into the void energies that bled from K'ur and seeped into the ground. Through the study of this power, the outcast began communing with the Void Lords. These monstrous entities responded to the orcs, bombarding them with visions of apocalypse and revealing the secrets of using shadow magic. The influx of void energies would gradually turn the exile's skin into a sickly white, and they would call themselves the Pale. Apart from creating the Pale, K'ur's dark energies had little immediate effect on the orcs. In the decades that followed, some clans engaged in trade with the Draenor, but most kept their distance. It was not uncommon for orc scouts, particularly young and curious ones, to survey Draenor settlements from afar. Some orcs believed that the Draenor were divine creatures, others did not. No one considered them to be a real threat. As far as the orcs were concerned, the reclusive Draenor were not much more than a passing curiosity. The ogres, however, saw the Draenor's isolation as a sign of weakness. Reclamation of Goria, 100 years before the Dark Portal. The ogres had been aware of the Draenor since the first day they arrived. The blazing ball of fire slamming into the ground had attracted considerable interest, and scouts from High Mall had kept a close watch on the Draenor's expansion across Terrakar Forest. When Shattrath was first built, there was an explosion of anger within High Mall. The Draenor were newcomers, smaller and weaker than ogres, and yet they were bold enough to build a city on the bones of the Gorian Empire's great capital. It was seen as an unforgivable insult, and yet Shattrath's sleek constructions and otherworldly defenses gave the ogres pause. Nothing like the Draenor's technology had ever been seen in this world. Their weakest apprentices had more refined and effective magical techniques than even the most advanced ogre sorceresses. When a new leader seized control of High Mall, he declared that he would conquer Shattrath. Imperator Hoklan, a gifted arcanist himself, believed that the Draenor had stolen their power. Perhaps they had some skill before, but they had built their city atop Goria. Who knew how much hidden knowledge it was left beneath the old capital? It had been the greatest center of Gorian power, the place where all apprentice sorceresses had trained. Hoklan incited his people to wage war by publicly sneering at the Draenor, calling them usurpers. He promised that High Mall would become the center of a new, enlightened Gorian empire once the Draenor were slaughtered. The ogres would not even need to rebuild their city. The Draenor had already taken care of that. High Mall's aristocracy threw their support behind Hoklan, eager to claim the extraordinary new city for themselves. Though the ogre army that marched on Shattrath vastly outnumbered the Draenor, it did not matter. The city's defenses easily repelled High Mall's first attack. There was never an opportunity for a second. As the ogres regrouped, Rangari and Vindicators launched surprise attacks from multiple directions, stabbing deep into the ogres' ranks. Akama led the elite force of holy warriors that included two of his greatest followers, Marad and Nobundu. They found and killed Hoklan and his generals, leaving High Mall's forces in disarray. Rather than slaughter the rest of the ogres, the Draenor immediately called off their attack and returned to Shattrath. Velen then appeared on Shattrath's ramparts. Wreathed in the scintillating light, he issued a single statement, his voice rumbling through the heavens. "Go home, and you will not be harmed." The ogres needed little encouragement. They fled. The grandiose war that was meant to revive the Gorian Empire had fallen after one attack, with an unexpectedly small death toll. The High Mall ogres never tried a frontal assault on the Draenor again. A delicate balance. 99 years before the Dark Portal. Before the ogres' attack on Shattrath, the orcs had seen the Draenor as mostly harmless. That was no longer the case. Word of the swift resolution to the High Mall aggression spread quickly. The Draenor's command of arcane and holy magics was unlike anything the orcs had ever seen, and that unfamiliarity resulted in suspicion. The gathering of the orc clans at one of that year's Karsh festivals was quite tense. Some clans resolved to avoid all contact with the Draenor. Others decided to treat them as enemies, vowing to attack the strangers if they ever strayed into orcish territory. The fact that the Draenor had taken care to minimize ogre casualties was seen as a weakness. A few orc chieftains speculated that Draenor hated fighting and would shrink away from a worthy opponent. The Karsh ended with no consensus, just unease. The Draenor had never shown aggression toward the orcs after all. Most clans were content to keep their distance. Yet, the Bladewind clan took a different approach. Since they inhabited the area between Terika Forest and Nagrand, they knew the Draenor's favorite trade routes and caravan schedules. When a number of caravans went missing on a single day, Villain and the exarchs took notice. The burning remains of the traders were soon discovered. Among the Draenor dead were orc corpses bearing Bladewind clan tattoos. It was obvious who had launched these raids. Most distressingly, some of the Draenor traders were missing. The orcs had taken prisoners. Many Draenor wanted to retaliate forcefully. Velen forbade it. He allowed the Rangari to launch covert missions to rescue prisoners, but an offensive campaign against the Bladewind orcs would only lead to calamity. The clan was not large. It would be relatively easy to defeat, but orcs were not known to surrender. The war would not end until nearly all the Bladewinds had died. And then what? Would the other orc clans be cowed? That was not their nature. Velen did not want war, but he also knew that the orcs respected bravery in combat. Future caravans were well guarded, often by squads of vindicators openly displaying weapons that glimmered with holy light. Any orc raiders who confronted the traders were usually defeated. Sometimes caravans fell, and sometimes more prisoners were taken. The Rangari managed to save a number of Draenor prisoners, but not all. These few poor souls were forced into slavery for the rest of their lives. Some of them bore children for their masters. Their half-breed offspring were rivaled and scorned by both Draenor and the orc cultures. The Bladewinds soon developed a respect for the Rangari and the Vindicators. Raids only took place on lightly guarded caravans, or when the orcs were led by the particularly bold or foolish. Ogrim and Durotan, 13 years before the Dark Portal. As the years wore on, a new balance took hold on Draenor between the orcs and the Draenor. Blood would be shed on both sides in occasional skirmishes. Yet, not all encounters between the two races were violent. An example of this was when two young orcs named Ogrim Doomhammer and Durotan crossed paths with the Draenor. One day, both of these youths would become great leaders. One day, both would change the destiny of the orc race in their own ways. Ogrim hailed from the Blackrock clan, and Durotan from the Frostwolf clan. They had met at one of the Karsh festivals. As the clan chieftains had discussed current events and trade agreements, Ogrim and Durotan had challenged each other in feats of strength and willpower. Their rivalry had blossomed into a friendship that would last for many years to come. Though friendship between members of different clans went against long-standing tradition, the Frostwolf and Blackrock elders permitted Ogrim and Durotan to maintain their bond. One summer, the youths met at the border between Frostfire Ridge and Gorgrond. They had been warned not to stray beyond this point, but Ogrim and Durotan were not orcs prone to following the rules. They set out into the thick forest of Terikar, where they were attacked by an enraged Highmol ogre. Ogrim and Durotan were strong, but they could not match the ogre's might. The brute descended on the youths, but he never had a chance to kill them. Rangari scouts had been tracking this ogre, who had strayed deep into Draenor lands. The Rangari emerged from the woods and felled the brute with their arrows. The Draenor hunting party's leader, Restalon, admired Ogrim's and Durotan's bravery, yet he knew they were in great danger from other ogres who were prowling the forests. He offered a safe haven in the nearby settlement of Telmor. Ogrim and Durotan were wary of the Draenor, but they accepted the offer. They had never been inside a Draenei settlement. Few orcs had. They were shocked by the Draenei's hospitality, but even more so by the wondrous technology and craftsmanship of Telmore. Ogrim and Durotan's arrival in Telmore was also fortuitous for the Draenei. Velen was in the city to meet with Restalan, after hearing of the two newcomers, who requested an audience with them. Of late, Velen had experienced strange dreams of the orcs, in which he saw them united and marching for war. In some of these visions, the prophet also saw a great shadow slowly creeping over Draenor. Due to his lingering injuries, Velen was not sure whether these premonitions had any truth to them, but he was determined to find out. While meeting with Ogrim and Durotan, Velen observed the two orcs carefully. He did not find any darkness stirring in their hearts. Much to the contrary, the youths seemed proud and honest. Under Velen's orders, Rengari's scouts escorted Ogrim and Durotan back to the borders of the Gorgrond. Their stay in Telmore had been short, but the two youths had learned much about the Draenei. They returned home with tales of the hospitality that had been shown to them, and the extraordinary sights they had seen. This event would mark one of the last peaceful encounters between the orcs and the Draenei.